Most near-death experiences happen to adults, but in 1979, a 10-year-old boy named Abraham Norfleet was an exception to this rule. One of the most important things he learned from this was that there is more than the worldly life as we know it. Abraham's story began when his father asked him to clean an underwater irrigation pump on their family farm one day. Abraham behaved like most 10-year-olds would. He confidently accepted the challenge, assuring himself that he only needed one breath to get the job done. His entire life, Abraham had been a kid that knew how to make the most out of any situation. That one day, while Abraham was casually hanging around the farm, his dad interrupted him because he needed Abraham to clean the algae that was clogging the pump the family used to get water to their farm. Abraham became irritated because he felt he already had so many chores to do. In his mind, he was enjoying his summer vacation and felt as if he weren't allowed to recover from his demanding school year. Besides, he was far too busy researching insects in the grass. Knowing his dad wouldn't budge, Abraham shook off his irritation and decided to readjust his attitude towards the chore. He already swam the creek for fun anyways, so what was the difference this time? That was the first internal nudge toward the life-defining incident. Abraham decided to approach the task as a game. He grabbed the scrub brush and took off. To get water to the farm, there was a cliff behind the workshop and the pigsty. Then there was another 50-foot cliff before it got to a creek. So Abraham's father laid a pipe from the farm to the creek and placed a 220-volt submersible pump with a plastic hose on it. The system ran 50 feet up the cliff to a large storage tank with a float switch on it. In this way, the family's land and animals were supplied with water. As it was impossible to descend the cliff directly, Abraham hiked to the point from where he could get to the pump on foot. However, the pump was located in a strategic area of the creek. Abraham's father positioned the pump at a spot where it was very deep, even in summer when the water in other places only came up to his ankles. With the water up to his ankles, Abraham could see the pump clearly and saw that, unfortunately, his father was right. The pump was full of algae, and there was no way it could pump up the water the family so desperately needed. Abraham thought it looked like a simple job. There was not too much algae present, and it looked soft. He could easily do this in one breath, Abraham thought to himself. He had reasons to believe in his ability to do so. All summer, Abraham and his friends would dive into the water and compete to see who could stay underwater the longest without taking a second breath. Abraham, as competitive as ever, put his all into winning these contests. By the end of the summer, he was able to call himself champion of the neighborhood and had even beaten a boy 3 years older. So even now, without the presence of his friends or the number 2 on the unofficial rankings, Abraham took his task of staying underwater as long as possible extremely seriously. He hyped himself up, took a deep breath, and dived. Once he reached the pump, he discovered that he would have to hold on with one hand and scrub with the other. To his surprise, the algae was not as soft and delicate as it seemed. It proved a tough job, and the suction from the pump didn't make it any easier. To get the algae off the pump, Abraham had to work harder than expected, so hard that he had to switch hands for a while and scrub with his left hand. The job took more time and energy than Abraham had thought beforehand. It was at that moment that he realized he needed air. A trick he had taught himself that summer was to first let out little bits of air through his nose. That way, he believed he could trick his body into giving him more time to get the job done. He really thought he was almost done. But even at 10, Abraham was not too reckless or too stubborn to keep going when he knew he couldn't. When he realized he couldn't go on, that he really needed air, he accepted his fate and decided to get out. His imaginative mind visualized himself as he pushed off the bottom, blowing out the remaining air on his way up and breaking the surface with his bubbles. Like a true hero, his face would emerge from out of the bubbles. Abraham's ambition and vision unfortunately proved too big for his body. The trick he had taught himself proved not to work in this situation. Still, he tried to carry out his plan. He blew out all the air he had and launched himself off the bottom of the creek. Then he reached up to pull himself up by the hose coming from the top of the pump. If this was the way it really happened, Abraham might never have achieved the inner enlightenment he went through life with. But it didn't. Along with the pipe, Abraham also grabbed a 220-volt power line whose wires his father had twisted together and wrapped in electrical tape. 220 volts went through his hand and the rest of his body, while still being underwater and with no air left in his lungs. The electricity clamped his hand down on the pipe, and no matter what he did, he couldn't let go. Every nerve and muscle contracted, and Abraham lost all conscious control of his body. At that moment, Abraham was arched over backward, his head upside down, and his eyes open, seeing everything in his line of sight, feeling everything that was happening to him. He could feel the electricity trickle down from his hand, where it was strongest, into his elbows, his arms, his palms and fingertips, his knees, his feet, and eventually it reached his heart. In a distinct memory, Abraham remembers the surreal feeling of his heart being clenched so tightly it didn't beat but buzz, as if it were a light. Not feeling his heartbeat made Abraham realize what was happening with crystal clarity. He couldn't let go. He was out of air, and his heart had stopped beating. He wasn't dying, but already dead. Facing those facts, Abraham was strangely calm. He accepted that this was the end of his short life. But when he took in everything in his field of vision, the minnows swimming around, the few inches of water before his eyes, the shore, the sand, the willow trees, and the clear blue sky with the sun, Abraham was disappointed. Even being the young boy he was, he had certain expectations of those final moments. He had expected his life to flash before his eyes. He was fine with being dead, but had expected to see such a film of his life as he felt had been promised. Just as Abraham thought about this disappointment, the sun began to shine and focus in the center of his attention. Then he saw concentric circles revolving around the sun in opposite directions. The circles kept coming closer to his field of vision, with more and more new circles emerging from the sun. As he stared at them, a center point caught his interest, and he looked at it. Suddenly, he could see through it as if it were a keyhole. He saw himself there, himself as a toddler, clutching his mother's skirt to stand. And he realized he shouldn't be disappointed after all. This is what it meant to see his life flash by before his eyes. The visions multiplied. He saw himself as a 3-year-old playing blissfully with his new dog, and as a 5-year-old putting the chickens back in the coop. Then he saw someone else. It wasn't him, but he looked like himself. He saw an older boy in a bright yellow t-shirt and blue nylon sneakers crossing a creek. The older boy's foot landed on an unstable rock, and it slipped under him, causing him to end up with his foot in the water. Again, this disappointed Abraham. This was not him, so this was not his life flashing by before his eyes. It was his brain fried by the electricity and lack of water. He was disappointed and upset, but he could no longer wallow in his feelings, because at that exact moment, the electricity disappeared and his hand was able to relax. Abraham realized that he was not dead. He was no longer electrocuted, but he still had one foot in the land of the dead. At the same time, he realized he was still not getting any air, so he lifted his head up out of the water and took his first breath. He was in pain, but he pushed himself up and got out. After that, the day went on as usual. Despite this life-threatening accident, Abraham went on with his life as if nothing had happened. Until this one day, a couple of years after the incident, when Abraham was visiting friends in a nearby town. Abraham and his friends were playing in a creek and crossed the water by jumping from rock to rock. Abraham unsuspectingly took another jump, but as he landed, he felt the stone slide out from under his foot. His foot landed in the water, and Abraham realized he had seen this moment before. He looked down at himself and saw the bright yellow shirt he was wearing and the blue nylon sneakers. The boy he saw was him. The moment that flashed before his eyes was a moment of his life, but it was a moment that back then didn't happen yet. Raised between religious beliefs and science, Abraham Norfleet found out something else that day. Something that was beyond both religion and science. a fundamental part of the grand truth no one knew. He realized that part of this great truth meant that there was a part of himself watching over him, an inexplicable part of him that existed apart from time and place. Abraham Norfleet now is a successful writer, comedian, and actor, best known for his writing and performance in the web series Goodstein, a series that revolves around a man who spends his day starting problems with his family, friends, and neighbors in comedic skits. The only real trait that defines the character's life is that he lives each day as it comes, with no overarching plans in life, a trait that, as we know, is intricately related to Abraham.